Good day, everyone. I'm Joe Rogers, President and CEO of the Texas Heart Institute, and I'm here today with Dr. Ambarish Pandey, who has just given grand rounds at the Texas Heart Institute on a really provocative topic. And it's, if I could just sort of summarize at a very high level, how evidence drives policy, but how policy then drives evidence. Mm-hmm. And I thought it was just a really stimulating talk and backed up with a lot of work that you and many of your colleagues have done, and really almost centered around the heart failure reduction readmission program, which I think started off as a pretty interesting idea, but had some unexplained or unanticipated twists. Mm-hmm. Maybe you could just quickly summarize that thought process and what you learned about that program after it was implemented and the unintended consequences of the program.
Right. First of all, thanks for having me here, and it was great opportunity to talk about this important topic to the audience here. So the hospital readmission reduction program that was initially implemented with good intentions to reduce the burden of readmissions through providing financial incentive, I think it was something that was implemented because it made sense theoretically, and I think without a lot of evidence to back it up at that time. And I think what happened over time is investigators have looked into the after effects and identified this potentially unintended consequence where while readmission rates have gone down, particularly for heart failure, there has been an increase and an uptick in the mortality rates over the last few years. And some of it may be related to the unintended consequences of having a financial incentive to drive down readmission without accounting for other important components of care that the patients with heart failure receive after discharge.
It's very difficult to model programs like this out in advance because it's difficult to account for what's likely to happen in response to those incentives. And I wonder, as you've thought through this series of programs and future programs that might try to incentivize not only quality but value, integrating cost savings, what level of evidence should we have before we implement so that we're not seeing some of these unintended consequences? And you said something in your talk that really struck me about how sort of we have, sort of paid the price for this program, but it's actually, it's the patients who have, I think, paid a price for what, in all, at the outset of the program, seemed like it was a very good idea.
Right. It's like if you think about medical therapies for heart failure, and I think the bar of evidence should be the same because what's at cost is patient lives. You would never approve a medication without a randomized controlled trial, and you would never approve a medication that can have a potential mortality signal, adverse signal with high risk of mortality. And that is what has happened. I think we should be able to test policies and in I think trials and in studies, and health economists and economists do that all the time. And there's a Nobel Prize that was given for randomized controlled trials for economic policies not long ago. And I think there are study designs that can be constructed with phased rollouts, with stepwise design cluster randomized trials that can actually test specific policies and its impact on patient outcomes. And I think that should be the bar. And I think the bar is no different for policies than medications. And I would again say, we can't imagine a scenario where a medication would be approved because it made sense without testing it in a rigorous manner. And that should also be the case for health policies because they also impact lives, probably at a broader level than medications.
Do you think that regulatory agencies have heard this message and have looked at the data and believe now that we should be doing some preparatory work before we roll out a program that may have adverse effects on our patients?
I certainly hope so, because I think it's the patient's lives at cost, and I think these policies impact almost everyone, every health system, and every patient that goes through the health system. So I think there is a need for health policy agencies to take a pause and look at it, and I think it will happen. I think as evidence comes more and more, I think it'll be hard to ignore the evidence, and eventually I think the health policy people are also well-intended and are focused on improving patient lives. So I think that change will happen.
The other thing that I loved about your talk was the idea that you're beginning to think about different endpoints. And rather than something that's very focused on hospitals or physicians, that you're actually flipping it and beginning to think more in a much more patient-centered way. And the endpoint that you described and presented some really provocative data for was days at home, which I think is really what matters to our patients. You know, that's their goal, is to be at home. And in that construct, if I understood your idea right, you wanted to sort of spread the risk for days at home out amongst not only just the hospitals and the providers, but also some of these long-term care facilities that our patients go to after they leave an acute hospitalization. And one of the things that I wondered is an unintended consequence of that kind of approach is, will that keep some of the LTACs and skilled nursing facilities from accepting some of these high-risk patients if they know that they may be going at risk for them?
That's a great question, and that's why I think even the concept of home time needs to be tested in a prospective fashion and needs to be rigorously evaluated. And I think there are, as you rightly said, there may be unintended consequences like SNFs and LTACs not accepting high-risk patients, or patients being discharged to home rather than a rehab facility when they need care. But if you look at it, if, for example, a high-risk patient does not go to a SNF and they go back to the hospital, then it should be on the hospital to get them placed somewhere where they get appropriate care, because if you discharge them without getting the appropriate care, they will come back to the hospital, and then the readmission will also contribute towards days lost from home time, and the hospital will still get the penalty. So I think the onus is going to be on the hospital to get the patient the right care with SNF placement, or the SNF that can get it. But I think if you incentivize the SNFs with models that give them incentive to provide good care, I think SNFs will have more resources and will be more willing to align themselves with the hospitals in doing what's best for the patients. So I think it's having a more comprehensive metric and more shared accountability will hold everyone responsible for making sure that the patient has the best outcome from that episode of care. So I think that should be the model, and I think that's hopefully what we will see with home time-based metrics.
Well, Ambarish, again, thank you so much. On behalf of the Heart Institute and those of you who are watching, we really appreciate all of the insights that you've provided for us today.
Thank you so much. Thanks.